All right, so I was discussing this interesting phenomena about how our beliefs are transposed into existence. And so even if you look at the language of basketball, okay, the guy just stole the ball. He just stole it. He attacked the defense, attacking, very aggressive. It's almost like animalistic. And again, these are the type of stereotypes that were tried that were placed upon black people. Um, when quote unquote, but I say quote unquote black people because there's no such thing. But when they were doing the slavery, they had to create a class or a caste that would be that could be maintained, and they artificially constructed this idea that there's black people, and then they said, okay, these people are savages, they're barbaric, and they and we need to civilize them, and uh, that's what slavery is going to do. It's going to give them Christianity, and um, it's going to pacify them, and it's going to bring them closer to it's going to tame them. But if you look at even the day, the modern systems where you see mainly black people doing basketball and trading players and stuff, almost like the slave trade, and it's kind of maintaining this type of system and this type of ideology that blacks are um, more um, aggressive and violent. Just the language that we're seeing in sports. He attacked the defense. He just they pounded that team. They that team was just they killed them. They killed that team. And this type of language is maintaining these social dynamics, this social structure. But again, how much of this is based upon genetics by nature, with the way someone is, and how much of it is cultural? A lot of it's cultural. So the idea that white people don't play basketball, they're more doing the academic stuff. That's, if you think about it, the idea of white people being more rigid. Well, if you grow up as you're supposed to be the upper class or the upper caste, then you're going to be more rigid. Whereas if you're the lower caste, you have nothing to lose. You're degraded. So when you're playing, you're gonna let it all out. You're gonna go all out, and then you're gonna practice going all out. Whereas someone who's seen as a higher class, he's not gonna work as hard. He doesn't have every. He's not at that point where there's nothing to lose, and he doesn't feel degraded in his spirit. So he's not gonna put it all out there. And a big aspect of sports is you gotta be loose. You gotta let go of everything. But if you have imposed upon you that you are the upper caste, you're a white person, you're the one who's more civilized, more restrained, then these belief systems, they carry themselves out, and they're perpetuated, and they're actually produced. People produce the belief systems and stereotypes um, that are imposed upon them. So how much of this is, oh, white people can't play sports, or oh, black people can't play sports? How much of this is I can't stand it, dude. I can't stand it when, like, a coach, I would have coaches who'd be like, oh yeah, the players on their team, they're very smart. Whenever it was a white team, this coach that I had, and I'd just be like, gosh, he's always trying to perpetuate and maintain these ideologies, maintain the status quo. And that doesn't help anything, because that's that fixed mentality. And regardless, even if there is truth that there's genetic differences, the idea of the fixed mentality is, oh, I'm this way, and I'm superior or I'm inferior, and then you're stuck within that mentality. Whereas if you have the growth mentality, you're not subscribing to any belief, identity, ego identity, but you're just going all out, and you're working hard, and you're discovering, and you're researching, and you're not constrained by anything imposed upon you, any identity. That we first have to accept it too. But like I said, when I played basketball, I always imagined myself as black, and I know that has a special effect, because I would think of my hair as being more curly, and I would think of myself as black, and when you feel kind of disparaged and you feel kind of like that, then you go all out, and you could let loose. You have nothing to lose. And I know that the stereotype effect is very powerful, because I've experienced it. And then and like I said, a woman might consider herself a Jew, and then she might act like a Jew is supposed to act, and then fulfill the stereotypes, especially if she's conservative, or somebody is told, okay, you're this, and then they act that out. And how much of this is cultural? You have these titles that you've been given since birth, but they're artificial. But how much of it is really natural? And we also know that just the aspects of growing up in the ghetto. Is that natural? Well, the conservatives want to believe that. Conservatives want to think everything is natural. It's based upon IQ and everything. But a lot of that has to do with there's been redlining. There's classes of people, and these ideologies have been maintained and are perpetuated. They're still functioning, and they create divisions within society around these artificial dynamics, divisions, disparities. And so you're going to have black people who are more poor, and then they're going to get more into the sports and stuff, and then there's going to be the white people who have more cultural capital. So they're going to continue with the academics, and then the stereotypes are perpetuated because then you have the role models in each group being maintained. So then the black people look at the black people role models and they're playing the sports, and the white people look at the white people role models, are doing the academics, and then they think, okay, there's other people like me who can do that. If they subscribe to that belief system, if they subscribe to that identity system, but it's very hard not to within the matrix. But the idea of transpersonal consciousness is we're moving outside of thinking, emotion, doing, dreaming, which is based around the ego, and we're moving to the transrational when we let go or we transcend the ego identity. But first you move into the ego identity. It's kind of inevitable that you have an ego structure. But the flow, the transpersonal is when you can break free of that, and then you're not confined by the limitations of your belief ego framework, and now you can actually see truth. And your thoughts are not being molded and distorted by the the identity that you previously ascribed to, or that you choose to ascribe to. Um, So I remember, like I said, I had this friend who was he's a Trump supporter, but he was black, but he said that he was like 20% white, and you could think, well, maybe it's because he's a Trump supporter because he's 20% white, so maybe he wants to, Trump was a white supremacist, maybe that's his white part of him that wants to do that. But again, that's still looking at things through that genetic Darwinian framework, but that's a belief system in and of itself. It might have accuracy within existence, especially if you believe it, and then you're going to see it act out in reality. But at the same time, what we do know, we can't affect genetic Darwinism. There might be genetic Darwinism, but what we do know is that we can upgrade our consciousness and upgrade our software, and we can understand and we can discern that he is manifesting dualistic ego consciousness, um, and he's still subscribing to the idea of white and black and stuff like that. So. So he's still holding on to an ego identity, and so when he would talk, he would say, "Oh, I remember we were talking about men and women." And at that time, I was still kind of subscribing to an ego identity, and he was talking about like, oh yeah, women, they're just all like, they just like the bad guys. They just like the bad guys. So he's trying to. So again, he has that dualistic mentality where he seems like a white supremacist. He's a Trump supporter. He probably sees or black people as inferior, if that's the case. Um, in conservatives, they want to justify the status quo by looking down upon black people, and he's still focusing on black and white regardless. He still sees things within that conservative framework. Whether he's a black supremacist or white supremacist, he still is brainwashed to believe that there's black and white, and doesn't realize that this is something that's artificial and superficially constructed in power dynamics. But so then he's believing this, and then he believes the same thing about women. So he wants to look at women inferior. So he has a judgmental, attitudinal, interpersonal consciousness in regards to women. He says, "Oh yeah, all women they just like men who are the bad boys and stuff, and they don't want a real good man and stuff." It's that idea of molding, putting all women in one category. And again, man and woman, that's also an artificial category. And the distinctions, there's men who are more like women, there's women who are more like the men. And actually, let's get rid of that whole concept. There's men who have certain qualities, there's women who have certain qualities, and even the disparities, a lot of it's culturally determined by how the woman is raised, determined by how the man is raised. And regardless of what we can do about the genetics, yeah, there might be a higher percentage of women with certain brain chemistry and men with certain brain chemistry, and that might create a little bit of differences, but you can't do anything about that. But what you can do is you can try to break free of that fixed mentality and work on just working hard and not prejudging and having prejudice toward a woman and shaping her and corralling her into that category that you expect her to be. And so, for instance, there's studies that even like women, when they're grading another woman's paper, they'll grade her lower in a math paper, even if she does as good of a job as a man, because she's expected to do lower, and that's going to shape that woman. So there's already prejudice, and so we're seeing that the woman's natural capacities, her capabilities, aren't really being presented, or at least people aren't seeing them, because their vision is being distorted by their egos and their prejudices and their expectations based around these artificial categories. We know that man and woman is a continuum, and black and white is a continuum, and within each group there's individuals, and there's so much difference between individuals within each group. There's going to be women who are very good at sports. There's going to be men who are very bad at sports, and there's so many variations. So, and regardless, if you're in dualistic ego consciousness, if you transcend dualistic ego consciousness, you're going to treat people with respect and dignity, and not prejudicially, no matter what class they're in. You're not gonna judge somebody based upon these okay, that person's a janitor, that person's a whatever, and then you ascribe these identities to the person. You don't really know the person. You're just giving them these labels, these identities, ego identities, and then you can't actually see the person. Um, so then what we have is, yeah, my friend was like, oh yeah, all women, they just like bad boys and stuff. But then I asked my grandpa, like, what do you think about that? What do you think about women like bad boys and everything? And in a genetic Darwinian perspective, that might make sense. Women want a bad guy, maybe because the bad guys in the old tribal days, they were the tribal leaders, and they had the best genes, and they were the savages, and maybe humans have a desire for savages. That's why the girls like the gang leaders and stuff, as my friend was saying, and the gang members and the bad boys and stuff. Is that why? My grandma said that's a conspiracy theory. Again, that's a belief system that you could subscribe to, and again, your beliefs might affect reality. Um, but then another idea that my grandpa said is, in the transpersonal perspective, being a good boy, being a conformist, that's not the flow. And somebody could be a quote unquote good boy, and he can try to make the girl happy, and give her flowers and do all this stuff, but he's really just ego oriented, and he's obsessed with himself, and maybe he's, whereas this guy, he's just focusing on the girl, and he doesn't have anything that he's going for, anything higher that he's pursuing, and he's still self-absorbed, and not in the flow. He hasn't transcended his ego self. Whereas maybe the bad boy who's in the gangs and stuff, maybe he's participating in something larger than himself, at least. And even if it is criminal activity, which is going to be predator prey, and dualistic consciousness, which is getting him stuck in his ego self, he still at least is engaged in some sort of pursuit and some sort of ritual practice that can be uh, leveraging his assets and his capabilities, and at least he's a part of something bigger where he can lose himself. So he's not just completely focused on her. And when you're just focused on the relationship with a man and a girl, it's self-dualistic ego consciousness, and that's self-confirmatory. And really what people want is to transcend the ego self toward the flow, toward the truth, because the ego self is what contaminates you from not being one with the truth, with God, with being. So at least the gang member, the bad guy, and also he's not being conformity. Conformity is not the flow, because like it's when you're playing basketball. If you're just doing what the coach says, coach doesn't know what he's talking about. But if also rebellion's not necessarily the flow, but at least it's a step toward the flow. So this guy's not conforming. He's not being a good boy. But then he's being bad. But at least it's a step toward the flow. Because the flow is not conformity. We know that. And then so maybe that would be why the girl likes the guy with the tattoos, and with the guns, and that type of stuff, because at least he's breaking free of the Vishnu ego preoccupation type of consciousness. And then if you want to look at that in terms of the um, the Great Gatsby, that's what Great Gatsby is all about. Is Gatsby, he loves Daisy because when he experienced Daisy, you see it in the movie, he had this kind of experience where he lost himself, he lost control, and so he was free of himself. He went from the interpersonal consciousness to the transpersonal consciousness, where he was kind of one with God. He had that transcendental experience with her, but he attributed that to her. He thought that was her, that was that experience. But really it was somehow when he was with her, he lost himself. And my grandpa says that you never really you don't really he didn't really love her. What he loved, what maybe he recognized, you never love a woman. What you love is maybe you recognize symmetry in her. Because if you love a woman, still that's the idea that there's a man and a woman and there's you and her, and this is dualistic consciousness. But my grandpa said what you recognize maybe is a symmetry. She has symmetry, and symmetry might open you to the flow, because symmetry is beauty, and it's taking you out of the idea of dualistic consciousness, because you see this beauty in it, and it can open you to a higher level of consciousness and help to somehow break you free of the ego. Seeing beauty, seeing symmetry, seeing things like that in the woman, in the quote unquote woman. And but anyways, Gatsby though in the story, somehow when he was with Daisy, he let go. And again, it's an idea that you can, when you're in a relationship, you can lose yourself, right? Even in like the sex, it's the idea that sex is paradoxical. It can be self-confirmatory, but also you can lose yourself with the other person by being a part of something larger than just your self preoccupation, but now you're with another person. So, I mean, this is a transpersonal psychology ideas. And again, evolutionary biologists are gonna say, no, there's no such thing as love. It's just chemicals in the brain, and it's just so you could reproduce your genes and stuff. That's his belief system, and there could be accuracy to that. But this is a transpersonal idea of transpersonal psychology. So, um, I just want to mention this one. Okay, on the last talk we were talking about voodoo, and then I want to mention one other thing too that's kind of interesting. But uh, and so the idea would be like a Vishnu worshiper, or someone who's following the Bible in the conservative framework and following the Old Testament, like a Vishnu worshiper, a more rigid oriented person, more tight laced. He might say, yeah, voodoo and stuff, that's against the Bible. That's witchcraft. Don't do it. You know, the Bible says you should kill witches and stuff. But then the Shiva consciousness, and the idea is, and even Jesus saying, we I have fulfilled the law, is that Vishnu worshiper, or that rigid oriented person, he could be completely ego oriented. He's still within the ego self, and he still has his beliefs, and he might have an agenda with his strict morality and rigid mentality. And so he's not really in the flow. So going against the flow and doing voodoo, I mean, going against the law and doing voodoo, not conforming, nonconformity could be a step closer to the flow than conformity. At least you can get in trouble in nonconformity and recognize the limitations of dualistic ego consciousness. They're both in dualistic ego consciousness. So like, yeah, the guy who's doing voodoo, probably he has predator prey consciousness and he's trying to hurt somebody. But at the same time, we don't know. Maybe he's just trying to explore, and he's researching, and he's trying to understand reality deeper, and he's he's experimenting. And any type of experimentation and exploration is expanding your awareness, and expanding your awareness is important because that can get you closer to the flow. Because if someone is stuck within a rigid awareness, in a rigid belief system, and he's not open to any new input, then he's not in the flow. He's stuck within a narrow consciousness and a rigid ego framework, and he can't have new insights and inspirations because he's not open to any new input. And then it's when you get a lot of data and have a large, big picture, comprehensive awareness, that's when the insights occur. That's the fourth quadrant, the transpersonal knowing, flowing and knowing. You do a lot of practice. You experiment with a lot of things, and then the idea is, people describe, they do a lot of studying, and they're trying to find the answer to a question, and then they sleep on it, and then maybe in the dream kind of represents the letting go of the ego body. That's the fourth quadrant of the third quadrant. Now that's when the truth comes to them. Now they're getting in the fourth quadrant, the truth going into being. Or they just do all this research and all this contemplation, and they're getting all this data, and then the insight occurs. It comes out of nowhere. But it's when they let go a lot of times. It's a lot of times people have these discoveries when they let go and they're not trying to come to the answer, and that's the idea of the fourth quadrant, the letting go, the transcending the ego body, because the synergy of all of the accumulation of data that you acquire through the sensations, perceptions, the first quadrant, and then all your beliefs, and then your thinking, emotion, doing. All these things are you're accumulating more and more data, and the synergy arises, and then a new insight occurs, which is the fourth quadrant that transcends anything that you could have anticipated from the previous data that you acquired, and it can't come through rational consciousness. The insight is almost trans-rational. It's almost an inspiration that you have to wonder, how did he even come up with that? And he doesn't even know how he came up with that. There's a lot of people who describe this. A lot of these scientists, they describe that they don't even know how they discovered it. It just came to them almost like supernatural. But they did a lot of research, they did a lot of preparation, but then somehow this all comes together in some sort of synergy. And when they let go, when they're not even anticipating it, it's not even them who's discovering it. It's not the rational thinking orientation, the first three quadrants, the third quadrant, rational consciousness, thinking, emotion, doing, dreaming. That's not even what's discovering it. It's almost something beyond them. They have to do the work, they have to do the preparation, but then it comes to them. That's that fourth quadrant, the flowing knowing, the transpersonal, the transcending the self, and then getting that insight or inspiration that comes not from you, but from something higher. So, and I wish I could remember all the examples of people describing that, but I've done a lot of research, and different scientists describe this. And there's even like people who've written, like Goethe, and people like that. They say that yeah, they did a lot of research, but then when they wrote their books, they say it was almost like it wasn't them writing it. They did all the research and they did all the preparation, but then when they wrote, it wasn't them writing it. They just let go. It was almost like a higher force was writing it. And I've experienced that for sure, for sure. When I wrote my raps, it was almost like it wasn't me writing it, because it's like the higher source. Or even like when I wrote my book of COVID stuff and all that stuff, it's like a higher source. But you have to do the preparation. You do all the thinking, emotion. You accumulate the data. But that's what I'm getting at with this voodoo stuff. Maybe someone's doing the voodoo and he's just doing it for research. And in that case, it's not dualistic ego consciousness. It's actually more toward the flow. He's expanding his self concept. He's widening his awareness as opposed to restricting it, and that can be beneficial. But again, we don't want to discount the Vishnu worshippers or the rigid moralists, because they have points. Voodoo can be dangerous. These witchcraft stuff can be dangerous. We don't know what type of different dimensions are in reality. Maybe there is demon type of stuff. And there's been cases where people describe they've done these voodoo type of things, and some sort of portals are opened, and some sort of crazy demons and crazy stuff occurs. And people get killed, people get hurt bad. Now, how much of this is belief? If someone really believes something, we know that there's been research that people, if they believe in voodoo, it affects them. People have died. We don't know if it was really the voodoo, but at least they believed it, and someone's done voodoo and they've died from it because they believed it so much it had an effect on them. Or maybe it did have an effect on them despite the belief. We don't know. But at least this is what the rational people, this is what the scientists think. They've done the research where they've seen people die from voodoo. And the rational people say, well, it's because of the placebo effect. But we also don't know what type of deeper dimensions there are. But again, belief's super powerful, and if the person doing the voodoo believes it, and a person who is getting the voodoo done to him believes it, then he can get really sick and he can die from that. But at the same time, we don't want to say, okay, all witchcraft is evil, and make it all illegal, because it can be a form of getting a deeper understanding of reality. Okay, let's research this. What's going on here? What can we learn from this? And learning is moving us outside of the ego self, because when you're learning, it can is and you're in discovery. Now you're not latched onto your ego, but you're being open, and you're acquiring new data and acquiring new experience that can help to evaporate the um, the glue that is consolidating your rigid ego framework, and that can help open you to the transpersonal truth, to the truth. The more data and experience you get. um, the more you broaden and widen your awareness. But at the same time, though, you have to be careful, and that's why the Vishnu worshippers, or the moralists, the rigid people, they say, okay, we have to have laws, we have to do these things because, again, there's no formula, and sometimes concessions need to be made. So sometimes people can get involved in witchcraft or doing drugs or doing types of things, and they can go crazy. There's no formula. They can completely lose their marbles because too much data, too much stuff going on, and maybe they do open up some portals to different realms, and things they're not ready for. They're not prepared for that. And instead of widening their awareness, they get caught. Their ego gets fractured, and they get into a state of terror and a straight state of restriction, not a state of freedom and liberation, but a state of being really locked in. And that can happen with drugs. That can happen with doing things like voodoo and witchcraft and stuff like that. So the Vishnu worshippers, or the moralist Bible people, the conservative Bible people, they have points. But then at the same time, you have to say this. So remember, I was saying that there's that story in the Bible where where there's a guy blasphemes God, a boy blasphemes God, and they stone the boy. So a lot of conservatives, they look at this and say, yeah, because they want to kill they want the death penalty, especially conservatives, because a lot of times it's usually people of color or marginalized members of society who do things like blaspheme God or do immoral things and get the death penalty. So the conservatives like this, and a lot of them think that it's genetic. Oh yeah, they're criminals because genetically they're bad, and it's a way to maintain power, maintain the status quo, and maintain their dualistic ego consciousness. They think they're white, or they think that they're superior for whatever reason, and they think that the bad guys are bad, and again, there could be black people who have this dualistic ego consciousness too. Um, but regardless, um, some people want the death penalty. But then, if you look at what the sages said about this story, that they say the reason why this boy blasphemed God was because he was a half Israelite, half Egyptian, and the Israelites had dualistic consciousness, and they believed that they were Israelites. They held on to that belief system, and they treated him bad. So the boy was marginalized, and according to the sages, the boy became schizophrenic, and he blasphemed God. But we know that actually schizophrenia is very much not genetic. A lot of people think it's genetic. There could be a component, but it's very much highly cultural and environmental. And they've done the studies that it's people who are marginalized, people who are abused, who are way, way, way more likely to quote unquote get schizophrenia, if it's something you can get, and if it's not just something that happens when you're marginalized and overwhelmed, and society continues that, and then they enforce and and maintain it by giving you the label of schizophrenic, or whatever label they want to ascribe to you, that that uh that separates you as a reject and a dejected member of society that they can abuse. And that's what happens to quote unquote schizophrenics, and they're abused with the medicine. And people say that's it's supposed to help them. It actually castrates them chemically, and pretty much tortures them. So so in this case, the person who blasphemes God, he's a marginalized member of society. Well, the same thing with the person who's doing the voodoo. The same thing with the person who's doing the drugs in a lot of cases. The conservatives want to say, no, it's natural. Drug use is genetic, and these people are making bad decisions because they're genetically defective and they're bad people. And oh no, they're doing the voodoo and stuff maybe because they're by nature evil. But a lot of this is cultural. If you're a marginalized member of society, you have nothing to lose. Okay, let's try this voodoo stuff. Screw society, screw what the law says. Let's check this out. Maybe we could do voodoo against those assholes that have been discriminating against us and stuff. Or if you're in a impoverished environment, you're around a lot of people with predator prey dualistic consciousness, because that's the mindset within your community, because you haven't had a lot of education and you have an environment that stunts people's growth and development. So they're doing voodoo against their neighbor because their neighbor, called him a bitch the other day. So now he's doing voodoo, and now they're doing witchcraft. And so it's going to be the marginalized members of society a lot of times who are probably the ones doing this. And that's maybe why women a lot of times get involved with the witchcraft and stuff, because they already know what it's like to be marginalized. So they're questioning things. They're breaking out of the rigid frameworks. They're breaking out of the Vishnu, conservative mentality framework, and they're exploring deeper, different aspects of reality, because they acknowledge the phoniness of the other way, and the ego orientation uh, that the so-called righteous people are portraying and presenting, and they recognize um, it's shallow, and so they're exploring deeper dimensions. So there's probably I only learned from the rabbi that one story with the boy who was stoned, about the backstory behind that, but there's probably aspects about the idea of killing witches. Again, probably the Bible's not really for that. If you look deeper into what the sages talked about, but the idea is somebody could be judgmental and say, "Oh yeah, witches. Let's kill the witches, kill the voodoo people." And then you look at the black community. It was the black community who was doing the voodoo. And again, that's the Vishnu conservative white people were were more doing in the Vishnu. Okay, no witchcraft, but then it was the people of color who were getting more into the voodoo type of stuff. And is it because they're people of color, or is it also a lot of the big aspect of it was that they're marginalized, they're being mistreated, and then they're looking into their voodoo type of stuff from their from their religions, from their societies, and and again, that's that Vishnu rigid orientation versus the hey, versus Shiva orientation. Let's break free of the rigid restraints of the law. Yeah, voodoo can be dangerous, but at the same time, what Jesus talks about, the law, he fulfilled the law. And the idea is a Vishnu worshiper who can be completely ego oriented and he's within the law, but he has ego agendas. And also, yeah, a voodoo person or someone breaking the law and doing stuff like that, he can also be ego oriented. He also has dualistic consciousness. But who's better? Neither one. Both of them can both transcend their ego dualistic consciousness to the flow. And judging the voodoo person, saying, "Oh, he's evil," not necessarily. You got to look at the environmental conditions. He's not necessarily evil, or the witch or whatever. And and if you're doing that, then you have dualistic ego consciousness. You're putting somebody down, right versus wrong. Oh, that's right, that's wrong, that's good, that's bad. That's still dualistic consciousness, and you're still getting involved in argumentation, and and there really isn't necessarily a right or a wrong, but there's always complexities and levels of discernment. And you see this in like the Indian societies, the Native American societies. They had heyokas, and what heyokas would do is they would do the opposite of what was moral. Like everything that everybody else was doing, they would do the opposite of it. And that's kind of breaking people out of their rigid frameworks, breaking them out of their conventional modes of consciousness, and maybe opening them to what's beyond the ego self and their conventional thinking, orientation. Thinking is the third quadrant, maybe to the transpersonal contemplation, passion, flowing, knowing, to the flow. Um, and then just one more example of this I want to mention. It would be like the Buddhists. The Buddhists, they'll have this one meditation where you imagine yourself to be a god. And I asked my grandpa, like, what do you think about that? Why would they do that? And then one idea is that it's the idea of transcending the ego self. You're not an ego body. You are God. You are divine. You're moving out of the ego body self to the oneness consciousness, to the flow. And also, it could be this idea that maybe someone's very humble, but his humility is ego oriented. He actually thinks he's inferior, or by acting humble, he thinks that he's inferior, and he's not really researching, and he really has a rigid ego structure, but he's just acting humble. It's an act, and he has these rigid belief systems. He's not really in the flow. So maybe if he worships and if he meditates and imagines himself to be a god, that can help break him free at least of that ego framework. Again, it might get him into a new ego framework of feeling that he's superior, and he's still focused on the ego body self and not in the transpersonal transcending the self. But that could be a step in the right direction. And any ritual again can help in the transcending of the ego self, and breaking you free of your normal patterns of thoughts and normal behavioral patterns, and your uh, relational patterns with other people. And by engaging in the ritual, this can break you free of that. And by getting free of, your thoughts are shaped by your ego, your beliefs are structured around your ego. You have these rituals, and that can help liberate you from all that, and maybe open you more to the flow, to the transpersonal consciousness, especially if they have a deeper meaning that you can awaken to. Uh, one last thing I want to talk about would be like, for right now, is I was just watching this woman, and she believes that she's a vegetarian, and she has a belief system that vegetarianism is the way. And so she is holding on to a rigid belief system, and because she has this identification, I am a vegetarian, she's holding on to that. This is her ego identity, and this is shaping her thoughts, emotions, doing, and everything. And she's very much attached to this. And so she's expressing a lot of dualistic ego consciousness. And so, for instance, she just posted a post where she was saying that, you know, what was that post? Oh, I can't even remember. It was something like, oh, because she's acting liberal. So she was like, people ask, why is it that transgender people don't, rape, use their transgender to go into bathrooms and rape women? Well, it's because it's easier to become a cop and rape women. So so okay, she might have a point. We don't want to look down upon transgender people. That's dualistic ego consciousness. And the Fox News people who have their angry faces, Tucker Carlson and stuff like, oh, transgender. There's only men and women. That's still dualistic. There isn't men and women. He's his attitude, his ego orientation is calling attention to his ego self, and he's still within dualistic consciousness, especially his attitudinal emotional reaction. So attitude, judgment is based around attitude. Whereas he can discern and he can say, yeah, some of those transgender people, they believe that they're a man or they believe that they're a woman, but there's no such thing as man or woman. That could be discernment, and it's transparency, and it's not any emotional attitudinal reaction to it. An impersonal, uh, action-oriented reaction would be, oh, they're transgender, oh, let's beat them up. That would be impersonal. Interpersonal is attitudinal, but regardless, they both are centered around the notion that you are a separate ego self. Somebody, but regardless, this woman, she has right versus wrong dualistic consciousness. She's saying it's right, transgender is right, and not transgender is wrong. But again, right versus wrong, that's dualistic consciousness. There isn't necessarily right or wrong, but you just look at the consequences. Well, maybe that person believes he's a woman, and but he's not a woman. But at least that's moving away from his belief that he's a man. But he still has a belief system. He's not yet in the transpersonal consciousness, to the truth that there is no ego self. He's still latching onto a rigid belief system. He may be still trying to call attention to his ego self. But still, we don't want to judge, because if you're judging, you yourself are promoting the false notion that there's a separate ego self. Um, so then, but then she's trying to look down upon cops because she's anti-civilization, because she's a vegetarian. She's saying, and again, is this predator prey? Is she want to beat up cops, or is this just attitudinal? Regardless, it's dualistic ego consciousness. But she has an identity that she's holding on to, and her identity is shaping the way that she's viewing things, viewing reality, and whether her vision, her belief system is accurate or not doesn't matter. Her belief system, her ego orientation is going to prevent her from transcending the ego self, from seeing the truth, which can only be seen once the ego is transcended. And that's the transpersonal consciousness. And that's when you lose yourself. So you're not engaging in right versus wrong attitudinal debate. um, or good guy, bad guy. Who's good? The cops are good. These people are bad. No, 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 the other way. That not all cops are the same. Not all vegetarians are the same. There's varieties of things, and these are artificial categories that you're imposing on things. A cop might have transpersonal consciousness, a quote unquote cop. Let's not even label him a cop. But of course, there's probably a lot of police officers who have right versus wrong dualistic ego consciousness, and who have uh, just dualistic ego consciousness in general. And there's cops who are killing black people because, or quote unquote black people, because they believe that they're black and they believe that black people are inferior, and they see all black people as one, as opposed to seeing people as individuals, and seeing that there's also white people who are white people are also individuals, and these are artificial categories. Yeah, there's police officers. A lot of them have dualistic ego consciousness. A lot of them aren't educated, and a lot of them haven't transcended the ego self. But to look down upon all cops, or to look down upon that itself, is dualistic ego consciousness, um, and it doesn't necessarily help because it maintains the same illusory mentality that that sustains the virtual reality of dualistic ego interplay that makes up the virtual holographic existence of the dream reality, according to Yogananda. That's all I really want to talk about right now.